So, Chinese immigrants have long had a pretty bad deal. For instance, here in Hong Kong, a lot of people fleeing the communists in the mainland have been reduced to living in cage homes. Plus, over at least the last 100 years, all over the world, there's been anti-Chinese riots. Now, these riots could happen for all sorts of reasons. For instance, in Vietnam in 2014, Chinese were targeted because China started building islands in the South China Sea. And in other places, they're often scapegoated and Chinese businesses are attacked. For instance, in 2007 in Lesotho, in 2006 in Tonga, in 1998 in Indonesia. In fact, in Indonesia in the mid-60s, they were often the target of anti-communist massacres, and they were attacked in Malaysia in 1969, and going back further, in around 1911, a couple hundred Chinese were massacred in Mexico, and a few years before that, they were targeted of anti-Chinese riots in Canada. And that's not to mention the countless riots against the Chinese in America. But the earliest forms of anti-Chinese riots can be found in the late 19th century when Yellow Peril was all the rage. Now, this was a term popularized by Kaiser Wilhelm, and it essentially was when Europeans feared that the Asian nations were going to rise up and conquer them. But some on the left also hated Chinese immigration. For instance, Karl Marx in the letter said the Chinese rabble, as he called them, were imported into America to depress the workers' wages. Plus, in England, many disliked Chinese immigrants being sent to South Africa to go work in the mines. And it was the trade unionists, around 50,000 or so of them, who protested in Hyde Park against this policy in 1904. But this finally brings me to my point. Across the British Empire, tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants started arriving in especially the likes of Canada, South Africa and Australia. And it was Australia who was the most fearful of seeing these new arrivals. For instance, in 1887, the Sydney Morning Herald ran a story saying that further Chinese immigration would likely be followed by an invasion. Then, around 1895, there was a book published called The Yellow Wave, and this detailed how a Chinese-Russia alliance would emerge, Russia would invade India, and China would invade Australia. Around the same time, a journalist named William Lane ran a 12-part serial detailing how a race war would erupt in the coming decades. Plus, the Bulletin ran stories saying that the Chinese were brutes and without any civilized thought, but could overcome their enemies through sheer numbers. And the Figaro published articles saying that prohibiting Chinese immigration was the only way to save Australia. So Australia was particularly worried for one simple reason. Britain had recently gained Hong Kong and was making a lot of money through trading with China. So most British MPs agreed that it was beneficial to the nation to keep China as an ally or at least a good friend. Plus, the Australians were worried that Britain was helping to modernise the Chinese military. The Australians therefore realised that they couldn't antagonise China by persecuting Chinese immigrants, but they felt very vulnerable. For instance, the Sydney Morning Herald said, if Great Britain had to choose between a Chinese war and a quarrel with her Australian colonies, her position would be an unfortunate one to say the least. They did request that fleets come be sent and patrol the Asian seas, but ultimately the Australians felt like they had been abandoned and replaced by Hong Kong and Chinese trade. So, many began calling that Australia choose to become more aligned with the United States.